So welcome to ACURA's panel marking the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, a Victory Day. And we have reached out to a remarkable panel of transatlantic voices of sanity to discuss several themes, topics arising from this anniversary, VE Day. VE Day and the lack of historical memory that Western leaders seem to have regarding the wartime alliance, the implications, geopolitical and other, of Russia inviting Xi of China to Moscow to mark the occasion, as Putin did on the 75th anniversary, and of course, recent developments with regard to the war in Ukraine. And I might add the narrative that Russia will expand inevitably, inexorably to the Baltics, to Europe, is deeply and tragically entrenched in the UK European elite thinking, witnessing, as I fear, general and generational rearmament program. If I might, before turning the panel over to James, and welcome Sevim.
Hi, Katrina. Hi, Anatol.
Hello, Sevim.
I just wanted to read very, very briefly an excerpt from Stephen F. Cohen, my late husband's War with Russia, where he writes that the living history that underlies reaction to the new Cold War is really related to this anniversary we're marking. Most Americans today believed, quote, "we defeated Nazi Germany," as President Obama wrote on the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II, a misconception fostered by Hollywood films, Steven Spielberg, Tom Hanks, that portray the US landing at Normandy in June 1944 as the beginning of the destruction of Hitler's Germany. I'm not going to say more except that Soviet losses were almost unimaginable. More than 27 million citizens died, 60%, 70% of them ethnic Russians. Most families lost a close or extended family member. This is an enduring part of Russia's living history, and it's in large measure why so many Russians, not just the Kremlin, have watched with alarm as NATO crept from Germany to their country's border since the late 1990s. So we're here today to talk about living history as we mark the 80th anniversary. And I'm going to turn over to James to introduce, again, our transatlantic panel of sanity, which is so needed in these times. But thank you for taking the time, all of you. I know how very busy you are.
Thanks, Katrina. So I think in thinking about the 80th anniversary of VE Day, I can't help but wonder why the celebrations aren't more straightforward, but the practice of commemorating history comes unavoidably, perhaps, with the risk of a distortion due to the coloring of contemporary problems. And this seems especially true in marking VE Day, while Russia and the West, who were allied during the Second World War, are now waging a proxy war against one another in Ukraine. Several of the questions I have for this distinguished panel will have to do with what seems to be the skewing, even falsification of history to further a contemporary political agenda, namely that of the collective West in its current fight with Russia. And I'm really pleased to be joined by three distinguished panelists. Mary Dejevsky is the independent columnist on foreign affairs in the UK. She was previously the Independent's foreign correspondent in Moscow, Paris, and Washington. Anatol Lieven is the director of the Quincy Institute's Eurasia program. He is a former war correspondent and a professor at King's College London and Georgetown University. Sevim Dağdelen served in the German Bundestag for almost 20 years. She was the spokeswoman for the Left Party parliamentary group on the Bundestag's Committee on Foreign Affairs, and she has a new book out on NATO. So thank you all for joining us today. Sevim, I'd like to start with you and get your opinion on a couple of comments, some of them alarming, from European leaders in the run-up to the VE Day, or Victory Day, as it's known in Russia, commemorations. The European Union's Foreign Affairs Commissioner, Kaja Kallas, said she basically issued a warning to European member states that any participation in the Victory Day parades or celebration in Moscow, and these are her words, will not be taken lightly on the European side, considering that Russia is really waging a full-scale war in Europe. She was actually outdone in this regard by the Ukrainian president, Mr. Zelensky, who basically issued a threat regarding the May 9th celebrations. He said, "We cannot bear responsibility for what happens on the territory of the Russian Federation during the May 9th commemorations." So I was wondering what you think this tells us about the mindset in Europe today.
Yeah, hi, James. I hope you can hear me.
I can.
Yeah. Well, as you mentioned, in Europe, that is led by people like Ms. Callas, for example, who had set the goal of war in Ukraine as the destruction of Russia, is basically doing away with itself, because Europe is suffocating as a result of this people's attempt to make war on Russia. So the problem is that people like Callas, who are certainly mentally compatible with the extreme right in Estonia, are now sitting at the center of Europe and think they can instrumentalize the peoples of Europe in a war to fulfill their nationalist policy of revenge. And that is what we are witnessing at the moment in Europe, and especially in Germany, because we are witnessing a very militarist revisionism in German politics. Perhaps it has not been discussed so much internationally so far, but there is this new militarism in German politics that considers it normal to station German soldiers on the territory of the former Soviet Union in Lithuania on the Russian border. So, and this is one part of this historical denial, for example, that we don't owe our thank you and spasibo for the Russian people as the representative of the former Soviet Union, to say thank you for liberation of Europe and Germany from the German fascism. And this is just one puzzle of this mosaic with this new militarist revisionism and this revenge, like we can see with Ms. Callas. And this is very concerning. I mean, I am very much concerned about this development. I'm very much, and people are in Germany very much concerned as well. We have a very heavy debate on the commemorations, about the commemorations of the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Germany. Shall we invite the Russian representatives to the commemoration events or not? And unfortunately, the German government decided the new one, but the old one is the same one. And the president of Germany also decided not to invite the Russian representatives to the commemoration events. Although I think, and I mean, this is really the most serious document of this historical political revisionism in Germany at the moment, which is extremely worrying, that they are insisting that representatives of Russia are not coming to these events. And this monstrosity of this cannot be surpassed. And of course, as I can see, there is a bumbling revisionism of Donald Trump, for example, as well. Katrina just mentioned Obama, but Donald Trump is doing the same at the moment. He claims that the US made the most important contribution to the victory in the Second World War. and this is obviously false. I mean, the extermination campaign of the Wehrmacht and the SS in the Soviet Union cost the lives of 27 million people, 10 million of whom were from the army. And I think this is this part of this new historical political revisionism in Germany, especially, but also in Europe. And the threat of President Zelensky now towards China and all other head of states who are willing to go to the victory parade on the 9th of May to Moscow is just, it's a very dangerous situation, and it shows us how irresponsible these head of states are with their threats in a proxy war, which has been to be ended a long time ago. While the negotiations are going on, he's threatening people like Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, not to attend the Victory Day. And I think this is the main aim is to rewrite history regarding World War II.
I want to get to the plans for the celebration in Moscow with Xi Jinping later on. I do want to turn to Trump's, as you mentioned, Trump's amazing Truth Social post. And for those who haven't seen it, I'm going to read part of it. He says that many of our allies and friends are celebrating Victory Day, but we did more than any country by far in producing a victorious result on World War II. I am hereby renaming May 8th as Victory Day for World War II and November 11th as Victory Day for World War I. We won both wars. Nobody was close to us in terms of strength, bravery, or military brilliance. Anatol, any thoughts as to how wide of the mark Mr. Trump was with this incredible post?
Well, in terms of truth, I mean, of historical reality, I mean, it was so wide of the mark as to have barely any relation to fact at all. In terms of course, of the opinion of ordinary Americans, and I fear by now many ordinary Brits, this basically corresponded to an attitude that I've been hearing for many years before Trump. By the way, speaking to an American audience, this is something of an exaggeration, perhaps, but I should say that the past British attitudes to the United States' role in the Second World War were much more honest and complimentary. We did admit that you provided some transport on D-Day. But, you know, when I was growing up, I don't know if Mary would agree, there was, you know, I mean, if one thing really emerged candidly from the historical record, it is that I mean, Britain, of course, won some victories, but in terms of Britain's position in the world, Britain lost the Second World War. And yet, still when I was growing up, you know, 60s, 70s, it was fading, but very much an impression that this was a British victory because, of course, of the year, but it was only a year in which the British were fighting pretty much alone against the Nazis. So, but I mean, it's, you know, when it comes to the memory of the Holocaust, I haven't been back for a number of years, but when I visited the Holocaust Museum, there was a plaque or monument at the entrance on the stairs about the countries that had fought against Hitler and thereby, you know, liberated the death camps. And it was in alphabetical order, which meant, of course, that the USSR was far below Luxembourg and Czechoslovakia, I think, perhaps. Of course, there was only one country that wasn't in alphabetical order. That was the United States, which, although also beginning with U, came at the top above Andorra. So there's nothing, alas, I mean, Trump is only representing a kind of grotesquely vulgarized version of, a feeling that's been around for a considerable time. I would say on that score that there is a certain logic, actually, historical logic or emotional logic about Xi Jinping being there in Moscow as well. Because in terms of sacrifice, if not of victory, the only country whose losses in the West have been more ignored, even more ignored than those of Russia, were those of China in the Second World War against Japan. And of course, the Japanese invasion of China began more than 2 years before, the Second World War in Europe. I always remember in general, very good and fair, rather brilliant British documentary series from the early 1970s, which Mary will remember, The World at War, narrated by Laurence Olivier. And as one would expect from a British series, it gave perhaps undue prominence to Britain. That's fair enough. It did give reasonable account of the Soviet role and the Soviet losses, I remember. It stated the extent of those losses very clearly. But there was not, in all the however many it was episodes, there wasn't a single episode, not one episode devoted to China or the Japanese war. And in terms of human losses, the Chinese came second only to the Soviet Union. So, in a way, it's right that they should be together. But I have seen in so many countries, but actually, Sevim, most of all, perhaps in Germany, how the change of generations has transformed attitudes to the war. Because I also remember on the BBC, when Marshal Zhukov died, they devoted an obituary program to him, as they did when Eisenhower died, and when Montgomery died, and Slim, because these were the commanders and our allies in the Second World War, and they had to be commemorated on British television. You would never see that today. But as I say, most striking of all I have found is the change in Germany, because in his old age, long after he'd been Chancellor, I had the honor to interview Helmut Schmidt, a strong opponent of NATO enlargement, for example, and who kept coming back to the Second World War, in which he'd fought in the Wehrmacht, and how this had given him, he was, of course, a dedicated anti-communist, but he felt this deep responsibility to prevent new war in Europe. And of course, coming from that generation of Germans, there was not an atom of self-righteousness about him. A sense of responsibility, yes, but no sense of moral superiority. And I've looked at him and then compared him. Annalena Baerbock is the worst, but many of the others as well. And it is very much as if they come from not just from different generations, but different worlds, different countries. I think Schmidt would have regarded, he couldn't have conceived that someone like Baerbock would be German foreign minister. He would have regarded this as beyond his imagination in terms of frivolity, arrogance, ignorance. So yes, the passing of the generations has had a very bad effect. Just one last thought. I think I may have said this in ACURA before, but every now and again it crops up this idea that in 1945 we should have gone on to fight the Soviet Union and drive them out of Eastern Europe. And this really, in a way, unstated, lurks behind all this nonsense about Yalta and how Yalta was a Western surrender and capitulation to the Soviet Union. All this talk rather ignores the fact that the Soviet Union had already, at the time of Yalta, occupied most of Eastern Europe as a result of defeating the Germans. Churchill asked in early 1945 the British General Staff to draw up a plan for possible war with the Soviet Union, which he himself codenamed Operation Unthinkable. And the response of the British General Staff was indeed that this is ridiculous. But I always remember years and years ago asking my uncle, who was a British officer in the Second World War, very conservative gentleman of his generation, but what he and his men would have done if in the summer of 1945, after fighting the Germans for 6 years, they had been ordered to attack the Soviet Union. And the reply of this very conservative ex-British officer was, we would have mutinied and shot our own generals. That was a realistic view at the time, which now, of course, this kind of thing is also totally forgotten because there's nobody left who was there.
Right. And that probably plays a role in the prevailing attitudes there. I want to turn to Mary, who I believe is joining us from London, to get a sense of British attitudes. So recently, the former British diplomat Ian Proud noted that as recently as 2010, British troops marched through Red Square to mark the 65th anniversary of the end of the war. And the grandson of Winston Churchill visited Moscow 10 years ago to celebrate the 70th. And he said there, we share in this victory day as Britain and Russia stood together with our allies against the Nazis. This seems impossible to imagine today. Why do you suspect that is?
Well, I think it's partly to do with, as Anatol mentioned, the change of generations. But it's also, it's a reflection of how Russophobic generally the UK has become in the years since Vladimir Putin became Russian president. There's been a hostility towards Russia that has built up steadily since the early 2000s. And I maybe have one advantage over the other panelists today, because London decided that it was going to celebrate, as it put it, rather than commemorate Victory Day, or VE Day, as it's called in the UK, that it was going to celebrate it early. So it's combined the public holiday of Monday, the 5th of May, with celebrating VE Day. So we have had a military and civilian and uniting of the generations parade from Parliament, through Parliament Square, down Whitehall, down the Mall, the general parade route to Buckingham Palace. We've had a fly past, which the weather just about allowed. We've had the whole of the royal family on the balcony at Buckingham Palace. And we are having also a massive tea party attended by members of the royal family for veterans and their families. It is, as VE Day generally is, it's a very British-centric occasion. But there was one difference this year, which you may have read also, which is we certainly didn't have any Russian participation in the British celebrations. What we did have was a Ukrainian participation. Now, it was presented in advance, I think in a way slightly over-presented, as though there was going to be quite a lot of Ukrainian military taking part in the parade. In fact, there were probably half a dozen with a big Ukrainian flag. And I think it was indicative of what's seen as the public mood in the UK, that there was sort of scattered applause as the Ukrainians marched with the rest of the procession down the Mall. And this was remarked on, the friendly relations with Britain, the massive support for Ukraine. the only dissent that can really be detected in the British public domain, there's been some dissent, I would say, from the veterans and that generation about the travesty of history that is writing Russia completely out of 1945 and is writing Ukrainian in. And then there is an even smaller voicing of dissent, pointing out the actual difficulty in historical terms of bringing Ukraine into the 1945 celebrations and the 1945 victory, given that half of Ukraine would have been taking part it would have been part of the Red Army, and therefore part of the actual Allied victory. But other parts of Ukraine had actually been fighting on the other side. So this is a very complicated situation regarding Ukraine in 1945, but it has been almost not mentioned in the British coverage of the war or in the invitation to Ukraine to take part in the procession.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Sevim, you had mentioned the new militarism that you see coming up in Germany, and it seems to me, as a very outside observer, that the politics, particularly around the war, the politics of the periphery have kind of taken over the politics of the center in places like Brussels and the Brussels bureaucracy. And it seems to me that that's kind of a betrayal of the vision that Willy Brandt had of Ostpolitik in the 70s. I'm curious about German opinion and whether or not there are differences between those who live on the territory of the former East Germany and on the territory of West Germany with regard to the war in Ukraine, and in terms of the memory of the war, given the different lived experiences of the people who lived in East Germany versus West Germany during the First Cold War.
Yeah, this is truthfully a point. Beside the other point that the younger generation, as you mentioned, the younger generation who haven't had any idea of war or war zones, no experiences, no grandparents anymore who can tell them from their experiences in Second World War, so that they can learn what war means. This is also a point we are facing in Germany, that the younger generation, they are very easily pro-war, pro-weapon deliveries, like the Taurus missiles from Germany to Ukraine. That would mean that we are in direct war with Russia. For example, they don't care about it, so because they haven't had any idea of war. And the other thing is, of Germany, of the east of Germany, there is truly a big opposition to the rearmament policy of the government, the former one and the new one under the new Chancellor Friedrich Merz, for example. They are totally opposing this policy, this new militarism in German politics that considers it normal, for example, to station German soldiers on the territory of the former Soviet Union. So at the Russian border, there is more sensibility in this. They want more friendship with Russia, in saying in figures, for example, when the majority of the German people, according to polls, are against weapon deliveries like the Taurus missiles, or in favor of negotiations, peace negotiations with Russia regarding Ukraine, about 55% or something, 75% in the East are in favoring this. Or let me give you another example. The signature of the German Chancellor last year in July at the NATO summit in Washington, D.C. with Joe Biden regarding stationing long-range missiles from the US on German soil in 2026. So 48% in Germany are against this deployment, and 78% in the east of Germany are against it. So we have a traditional position of the East Germans, friendship with Russia, a policy of détente with Russia, although it came from the Social Democrats in the west of Germany. But the former GDR people and also a lot of the younger generation in the East as well, they are traditionally in this position to be, friendly with Russia, peace in the East of Europe. And this is totally a difference, a distinction to the rest of the Federal Republic of Germany. Because in the West, traditionally, you had this anti-communism campaign. It still goes on sometimes, and this anti-Russia. Anatol Lieven, I was, since 2009, a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee and was witnessing the whole period of Annalena Baerbock as a Minister of Foreign Affairs in Germany. And I totally agree that it was really one of the worst foreign ministers in German history. But it can be really worse, I've learned. And the new one, Johann Wadepool, for example, he stated with his sentence, Russia will always be our enemy and always be a danger to the security in Europe. I am very glad, politically and personally, that the period ends with Annalena Baerbock as foreign minister, and I'm very, very sad, and unfortunately, she wants to be the president of the United Nations General Assembly now, so the Global South has to handle with her. But as we can see with this citation of Johann Wadepool, the next foreign minister, it can be worse. So this anti-Russia policy is really a piece of the DNA, we can say, of the conservatives in the west of Germany. And another thing I would just like to mention is that the Anatol Lieven, he just mentioned the genocide and the Germans down to the Soviets. We are, I just have to say, the German government never, ever recognized this as a genocide to the Soviet people, to the Slavic people in the Soviet Union. They never did this. And they always focus on war crimes, but they never wanted to accept or recognize this as a genocide of the Slavic people. And this is a part of the historical revisionism, to refuse to recognize the genocide of Slavic people. Because we know from the historical research of the last 30 years, for example, that both the starvation plan and the Lebensraum concepts were based on the extermination of 30 million Slavic people. And during the blockade of Leningrad alone, the Wehrmacht deliberately starved more than 1 million people to death. But the German government, they, as I said, only wants to talk about war crimes. And this is oblivious to history. It's a denial of history and a slap in the face to the victims. And a policy of an disengagement would also imply that the West is no longer to try to falsify this historic truth in reaction of the Russian instrumentalization of history observed by the West for the war in Ukraine. That's why, for example, nowadays there is a discussion: isn't it time to recognize this blockade of Leningrad as a genocide of the Slavic people?
Thank you for that. And I think not too long ago, the government in St. Petersburg, the local government, officially said that they believe it to be genocide, the siege of Leningrad. Anatol, I think one of the things that people should think about when they think about VE Day is that it was really quickly followed by a period of what I would term kind of like a lost peace between Roosevelt's death in April of 1945 to the Novikov telegram sent from the Soviet ambassador in Washington in September of 46. It was an 18-month period where the spirit of the Elbe was lost. It was squandered. And it didn't have to be that way. You know, during the war, Americans forget this, of course, but, you know, you had American figures from on the right and the left who were in favor of friendly relations with the USSR, people ranging from Henry Wallace to Herbert Hoover. You had Life magazine publishing articles. This is from a book by Robert Dallek that says the Russians were one hell of a people who, to a remarkable degree, look like Americans, dress like Americans, and think like Americans. And then you had the Truman administration and kind of the end to all of that. So, you know, I think that's one of the things that's probably worth keeping in mind when we think about VE Day is how quickly everything went south. None of this was foreordained, don't you think?
Well, I mean, in terms of a competition between communism, which after all was still, you know, an ideology and which felt itself, of course, in 1945, not without reason, to be a victorious ideology, and the capitalist world, there were real built-in elements of conflict. And you know, well, look, if it had been a different Russia, the Second World War wouldn't have happened because Russia, Britain and France would have combined, you know, in the 1930s to crush Hitler before he could have, you know, done anything. The Bolshevik Revolution and the consequent exclusion of Russia from the security equations of the Western powers, you know, in many ways led to the catastrophe of the Second World War. My own sense is that if you know, if Moscow had only asked for the stationing of Soviet troops in Eastern Europe, in Eastern Germany, you know, and security guarantees about neutrality and so forth, that would very few people in the West, certainly in Western publics, would have resisted that, because of course everybody was worried about a revanchist Germany, you know, and the problem was that the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe was, of course, accompanied by the communization of Eastern Europe, and of course, beginning with Poland. Now, the Poles, I mean, given their behavior in the 1930s, have received a grotesquely free pass in terms of historical analysis, you know, from the West. And indeed, I mean, that Polish record, I've known people who claim, you know, Western diplomats serving in Poland who simply did not know because nobody had told them and they were too lazy to find out that, Poland signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler in 1934 and participated in the carve-up of Czechoslovakia. But nonetheless, of course, the imposition of communist dictatorship in Poland was a nasty affair, without question, as it was elsewhere in Eastern Europe. And one should not underestimate the horrors of the Stalinist regime and regimes. So in some ways, of course, it does go back to the tragedy of the communist revolution in Russia and its long-term effects, obviously for Russia itself and the other countries of the Soviet Union, for the Eastern Europeans, but also in the long run for Russia's relations with the West. Because of course now one sees, well, precisely, I mean, as Annalena said, this ridiculous line about how Russia has always been an enemy of the West and always will be, and Keir Starmer's promise of 100-year British pact with Ukraine, against Russia, as I pointed out, in 1814, Britain was an ally of Germany and Russia against the French. 100 years later, it was an ally of the French and Russians against the Germans. 100 years from now, and of course, the very concept of the West is something which emerged partly from the First World War, but really, from the Second World War and the Cold War, because where precisely do you place Germany and Austria, historically? If you're trying to turn this into, a permanent geopolitical alignment, it doesn't work. And yet, through a mixture of prejudice, hatred, and sheer historical illiteracy, it has become the fixed doctrine. Because Mary said that, and as far as the general public is concerned, I mean, that's true, that, since Putin, there's been this, Russophobia in growing in the British public. But on the other hand, as I'm sure Mary well remembers, throughout the 1990s, when, Russia really was trying to maintain good relations with the West, you had people in Britain working assiduously to portray Russia as an eternal enemy, to fix upon, every Russian action, even when Russian protests were entirely legitimate, as they were, for example, over the treatment of Russian speakers in the Baltic states, that this was portrayed as evidence of eternal Russian aggression and imperialism. So, I mean, Putin on his side has, of course, a great deal to answer for, but by no means everything.
Thanks, Anatol. I think in the remaining time that we have left, I'd like to turn to some contemporary matters. Mary, let's talk about for a second what Moscow is going to be doing on the 9th. So the guest of honor is the Chinese president. There have been news reports that Putin and Xi are going to sign a series of agreements, but they haven't said what sort of agreements. And then on the other side, we have here in Washington, the Trump administration, far from walking away from Ukraine, is picking up the policies of the Biden administration and sending Patriot missile defense batteries to Ukraine, and another 50 million in direct arms sales, and 310 million for the training of pilots to fly F-16s. So maybe help us tease out the implications of these two things: the deepening entente between Moscow and Beijing on the one hand, and the Trump administration seeming to walk away from negotiations, but in a way, fanning the flames of the conflict in Ukraine.
I find it very, very difficult to read the Trump administration's attitudes to Russia and Ukraine at the moment. It seemed quite simple at the start of the Trump administration, but now it looks much more complicated. There is also the European aspect, because as I say, at the outset of the Trump administration, it looked as though the US was going to be working absolutely single-mindedly in one direction for ceasefire, peace talks, and hopefully an end to the war in Ukraine. At the same time, the Europeans, with Keir Starmer, President Macron, and anybody else who happened to show up at the various meetings with different participants, they seem to be doing their absolute utmost to sabotage the attempts to end the war, which were coming from Washington. And there've been various what looked like sort of attempts to square the circle between these two ventures, but nothing has happened, and it's not clear at all to me whether the fact that the hope for negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, brokered maybe by, or encouraged at least, by the Americans, whether the Europeans actually managed to sabotage that and to present themselves as being able to carry on the war and support Ukraine to the point where it could actually sustain the war against Russia. Now, you asked about the Russian Victory Day parade, which appears to be Russia absolutely pulling out all the stops. There's going to be a gigantic military parade. Xi Jinping will be there as guest of honor. There'll be various other leaders from around the world, though maybe not from the European Union. But it seems to me that there is actually a danger of exaggerating the closeness between Russia and China. It seems to me that what we're looking at is really not an alliance or even a potential alliance. We're looking at an arrangement of mutual self-interest, which works for the moment, but not probably eternally. But the other aspect of the Russian parade and the meetings in Moscow is a distinct effort by President Putin, and I mean, in a way, who can blame him, to demonstrate that the concerted effort of the West, of the United States and the UK, to isolate Russia after the invasion of Ukraine, that has failed. And I think we're going to see that very clearly demonstrated on Friday.
I think that one of the things that, it's VE Day is about the end of a war. It's about the enormous sacrifice and death and tragedy, and then the 40-year Cold War that followed. During the Cold War, you had politicians as different as de Gaulle and Gorbachev and even George H.W. Bush talk about a common European home, or H.W. Bush called it Europe on free. So I want to end by asking the three of you, how far away are we today from that vision? I'll begin with Sevim, then Anatol, and then Mary will finish up.
Well, I think we are pretty much far away from this vision, and because the new militarism in German politics, for example, is targeting Ukraine as a German sphere of influence and a European use, and declaring Russia to be the eternal enemy. And if you just try to put yourself in the head of the self-declared enemy for a second, so against the backdrop of Nazi Germany's genocide against the Russians, so you must be aware that Russia is mobilizing all its forces to arm itself against this danger. And when you then see the discussion in Germany and Russia's plans in Moscow to supply Taurus, the German Taurus guided missiles to Ukraine, as the future Chancellor Merz has promised, and still he is promising this, that it is clear that we are on the brink of world war, and it is German government policy that is playing with the fire here and relying on being able to continue the proxy war in Ukraine against Russia, even without the United States. And so it's a very dangerous period we are going through. And I think nevertheless, we have to focus all the peace and freedom-loving people in the world, especially in Europe. We have to focus on our hope for peace in Europe. And I think the 80th anniversary actually is a good turning point, could be a good turning point for a new dialogue. And today, 70 years after the beginning of the disengagement policy in 1955, I think the world needs a new effort for the new disengagement policy. Therefore, we would need the realistic and responsible approaches of politicians like George Kennan, who some 50 years later warned of the enlargement of NATO towards the east because he knew what would be at stakes. But I always have hope that we have people all around the world to focus and to stick on this policy of peace and dialogue and détente. And even if the German official politics is going to a false direction, my hope is always the people. So according to the polls, there are still a majority in the German population. And as far as I know, even in Europe, on the European continent, it is the majority for peace, for dialogue, and a politic of détente, a politic of friendship. And I think it's our duty to promote this and to fight for it.
Thank you. Anatol.
Well, I entirely agree with that, and I'm personally deeply sympathetic to Sevim's views and policies on this. However, the tragic thing is that the way things look at the moment, if there is if there are forces within Europe that could transform attitudes to Russia, to the war, to the idea of, yes, I mean, a common European home, they are, it must be said, historically speaking, very remarkably, but they are on the right. They're on the populist right. They have more sympathy with the Putin regime in some ways. And of course, they have more sympathy, especially in America, with J.D. Vance. And Vance himself, of course, is an interesting figure from that point of view. I was looking at a French magazine the other day whose cover portrayed him as a Holy Roman Emperor. You know, this idea of leading a new Catholic conservative, but a new Catholic conservative West. You know, that's the thing. You know, Trump doesn't care about Europe, whereas Vance, in his own funny way, does. But and so I don't think that present attitudes are set in stone in Europe. But of course, this trajectory gives us many other things to worry about, alas.
Mary.
I'd like to offer maybe two very different perspectives. One of them is that I think that at the very beginning, Donald Trump was actually on the right track when he wanted to negotiate with Russia before negotiating with Ukraine. Because it seems to me that Russia's desire for and need, from its perspective, for security in Europe is a precondition for security for Ukraine. And Trump seems to understand this, and I'm not sure that anybody else does. But it doesn't seem to me that the possibility of negotiations between Russia and the US are actually off the table, and I hope that those will actually pick up and there'll be some outcome from that. The other is a very parochial point maybe, but takes us back to the beginning, which is that it would be interesting to consider with a longer perspective how far Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, as an admirer and biography of Churchill, and somebody who saw the Second World War and Britain standing alone in that particular light, how far the parallels that he saw between Ukraine facing Russia and Britain standing alone against Germany, the parallels he saw between Zelensky and Churchill, how far those actually, because Boris Johnson was such a strong and persuasive character as British Prime Minister, how far that has dictated really a lot of the European response to the invasion of Ukraine and the attitudes to Zelensky at the very beginning. And I think that with the benefit of much, much longer term hindsight, that could come to be seen as a very, very big liability.
Well, thank you for that. And I think on that note, we'll close. I want to thank the three of you on behalf of the American Committee for US-Russia Accord for joining us today for this really valuable discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Pleasure.